running a little bit behind schedule, so we'll have to move on to our next speaker. And that's Joel. He'll tell us about some astronomy book suggestions. Go ahead, Joel.
Oh, thank you. All right, so my talk is 30 popular astronomy book recommendations from my library. I figured that because of COVID and we're doing this remote, I would invite you into my house, and you can see this is just one of my many bookshelves behind me. And over there, I've organized all my astronomy books. Actually, not all of them, just most of them. And I'd like to show you some of my favorite recommendations. Just as an introduction, one of my passions is nonfiction books. I run a Facebook group. We have over 6,500 members now. So if you are active on Facebook, be sure to check it out, facebook.com/groups, serious nonfiction, all one word. There are some questions you can answer to enter the group, and you can see there's some lively discussion going on there. For this talk, the target audience for my books is going to be beginner and amateur books. Most popular books are written for such an audience, focusing on history, biography, basic science. I'm trying to stay away from those specialized books about astrophotography or some sky atlases, 50 objects you can find in the sky. Maybe because that's a little bit more for an advanced audience. So for the audience tonight, you might find this a little basic, or you might find it interesting, the historical or the science angle of it. And I've rated these books for accessibility and engaging writing style. So anything that's too technical, I've tried to stay away from. So these books are all very, very approachable. What I'm going to do now is I've got another camera set up here, and I'm going to switch the view and show you on my other camera. Just get a little closer. This camera can show you a little bit of the bookshelf. Here, so I can. The first, everybody see there? Yeah. So the first books I'm going to show you, actually, this is the only fiction book on this list, is The Martian. A lot of you might know the film that came out a few years ago with Matt Damon. This book is really, really great. You can see I've got two editions for it. There's actually this one over here is a classroom edition. What they've done is they've cleaned it up a little bit. There's a little bit of the language, because this book proved to be such a popular book for teaching kids science. The attention to the science in these books is really, really high attention to the scientific detail. So that's a fun book to give to kids to read. I gave it to my daughter, and she read it, and then I let her watch the movie, and it really is a great book for sparking interest for kids. So that's why I've included this book in here, even though it's a fiction book, but it's a great introduction to science. And because now you can see Mars so bright in the sky, next time you have a chance, look up at Mars, and you might find some of those geographic features that the book talks about. So the next section of books that I'm going to focus on are books which are sort of introductions to observing. The first book on my list is The Stars by H.A. Rey. H.A. Rey, you might recognize, is the author of the Curious George series. And this book is a book he wrote about astronomy, but it's got that same style of illustration. You can see he's got, those are the different constellations. He tries to teach it to you he changes from the old way of looking at the constellations to a new way, which helps you imagine it a little bit better. And it's got some really nice, witty comics in here. There's a little kangaroo down in Australia saying, "The Dipper, never seen it." And the middle section of the book is got sky charts, and the last section of the book even tries to explain to you exactly. I really like this illustration. It really helps you picture where's east, where's west, how are we turning relative to the sky. So it's an old book. This is probably 50 years old. It's come out in several editions, but it's a really good introduction to observing. The next book on my list, let's go through the slide. Next slide here is Night Watch. I don't own a copy of this book. I got this from the Toronto Public Library. This is by the Canadian. I think he is probably an emeritus member of the RASC, Terrence Dickinson. This book is really great. It's got really comprehensive. It's got everything from observing techniques and what equipment to use and where to look, everything you need to get started with stargazing and observing. And it's spiral bound, so you can take it out with you in the field, and it'll last Likewise, there's another one here. This one I haven't read, but this one's been recommended to me. It's called Turn Left at Orion, also spiral bound. You can take it out into the field, and it's sort of a guide to the sky, how the sky will look at different seasons and what to look for, and how to find your way. And of course, next slide here, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Observer's Handbook. Now, this is not really a book you can read from beginning to end. It's very detailed. It's got lots of great reference material. Anybody who's a member of the RASC receives one of these, and this is a good reference manual. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole bunch of books you can get on astrophotography, a whole bunch of books that will give you different ideas to look for, things to look for in the sky, things to photograph in the sky. I don't actually own any of these because I find most of this information I can find online, and it's harder to find these books at discount prices. Most of these books I like to buy at discount. So some of these more technical or specialized guides is a little harder to find. But there's lots of great ones out there. The next section is general history. So this is one of my favorites. My favorite one here is Bill Bryson's. Some of you might know this. Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything. If you haven't read this book, I highly, highly recommend it. And this is the special illustrated edition. It's got beautifully illustrated full color illustrations here. This is just some of the chapter titles. It covers all areas of science. Astronomy is really covered more towards the beginning. There you got who was that, Wilson and Penzias. I think this is a famous photograph of them at their observatory. But this is Percival Lowell at his telescope. But it's fully illustrated, this edition. If you're going to get it, see if you can find this one. It might be a little pricey. But if you can't find the illustrated edition, it's a great book. He's very, very, very funny. And what's nice about him is he's a trained journalist. He's not a scientist at all. So his writing style is more focused. He writes like a journalist. So it reads really, really, really well. But impressively, as a journalist, he really spent a lot of time researching the science, and he got the science mostly right, which I'm very, very impressed by. The next book in general history is a very well-known one. This is Timothy Ferris, Coming of Age in the Milky Way. This is a full history. This is one of the best books I found on the history of astronomy and man's understanding of his place in the universe, going all the way back from the ancient Greeks all the way up to the 20th century. And there's a big focus on the 20th century. So he goes through all the major breakthroughs. It's a couple of decades old, so it's a little bit out of date, but it still holds up really well in terms of a general history book on the history of astronomy. It's still one of the best ones out there in the market. Timothy Ferris has actually got a whole bunch of books on astronomy. This is one of the topics he likes to write about. I've listed some on the slide over here. It's not that Timothy Ferris. If you Google Timothy Ferris, you're more likely to get the Timothy Ferris who writes a bunch of business self-help books. That's Timothy Ferris with 2 S's. The Timothy Ferris that's a science writer is with 1 S. And this is just some of his books. This book I really like. It's called Seeing in the Dark. And members of our club might really like this because it's really about how backyard stargazers are probing deep space and guarding Earth from interplanetary peril. So he's got chapters here on people that look for comets, and it really shows you about. He's got interviews with some of these amateur astronomers and showing you how some of the contributions that amateur astronomers made, like the Halley-Bopp comet, for example. He has an interview with them, and he shows you how much contribution amateur astronomers actually make to the field. So that's really great for our group. Going back to, so I said Timothy Ferris is really good. If you want something a little bit more up to date and a little bit more approachable style, this is Simon Singh's Big Bang. Also focuses on 20th century Hubble and our understanding of the Big Bang and the size of the universe, the age of the universe, and all that. This is a really good book. Simon Singh is he's a really funny, easy author. He's even, I'll and the next slide here, he's got a whole bunch of other books, mainly focusing on math. He's even appeared on the Numberphile channel on YouTube. If you're not familiar with the Numberphile channel on YouTube, definitely check that out. Simon Singh is on there, and he's really into the science math outreach. He's even got a book about the Simpsons and math. So you can see what type of guy he's somewhat humorous too. So that's a good approachable one. It's sort of comparable to the Timothy Ferris one. There's a couple of others. There's Arthur Koestler, The Sleepwalkers is a very famous one. This is from 1959. So this is a classic. Arthur Koestler is a well-known novelist, more of a literary type. So this book is a little bit more philosophical, say. It doesn't focus so much more on the modern period. It focuses more on the ancient period. But that's a classic, so I've included that one. As well, Daniel Boorstin, not so much on astronomy, really. I've included this one also because it's somewhat of a classic, published good almost 40 years ago. But he talks about really the entire human understanding of our place in the universe and economics and biology and all that, and how the different religions played a role. So Islam and Christianity and the interface between the two. So it's really much more wide-ranging than just astronomy, but I've included it in the list because in the first few chapters, he does talk about how that sort of impacted man's understanding of their place in the universe. The next section of my recommendations is what I call Tour of the Universe. So this is sort of going in the Carl Sagan style, where you start on Earth and you start on a journey through the solar system and then to galaxies and the Big Bang, and then it starts getting wider. So obviously the first book on that recommendation list is Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Again, this is based on he had a TV series which was very famous, and this is the book that sort of came out at the same time. And this edition of the book is also a illustrated edition of the book. So he's got beautiful pictures. I mean, this is a picture imagining what living on a planet which would be in the solar system instead of the sun, you'd be living with the Ring Nebula as the sun of your system. And the book is likewise full of full color illustrations. This is the famous moonshine photograph taken from the moon, or not moonshine, the sunshine, earth shine. That's the name of the photograph. So this book is, if you are going to get the Carl Sagan, this is the illustrated edition, and he's got likewise Comet, which is another book he wrote with his, then became his wife as Andrew, and I think she also produced the show, and it has the same thing. It's full of these nice, beautiful color illustrations. I find Carl Sagan somewhat contemplative at times. He gets a little bit philosophical, but he's fun. He's nice to listen to, and he's got many other books. These are just two of them, but another couple I have is Billions and Billions and Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, and he's got many more. And so I'd recommend checking him out if you like his style. In a similar style as Neil deGrasse Tyson, I don't think he comes to the level of Carl Sagan, in my opinion, but he's a great voice to listen to. So this is a recent book, Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. A lot of people might have heard of this book. I found a audio version on YouTube, so you can listen to him talk about it. And he follows the same style as Sagan. He talks about the Earth and the atmosphere of Venus, and then on to Mars and Jupiter, and then galaxies, and then he talks about time travel and UFOs and extraterrestrial life and all that. Another book in that, which I'm going to get to later, is The Planets by David Sobel. But I grouped that with a bunch of other books in her, so I'm going to talk about that later. But she's a similar style to that. The next group of books is Relativity, Big Bang, Theory of Everything, String Theory. This is a very popular genre of books. Perhaps the most popular is Brian Greene, but the one I started with here is 1, 2, 3 Infinity. This is a classic. I really recommend this book. It's really fun read. He's got great little illustrations there, really funny illustrations, and he explains some of these concepts. Like here he is explaining Minkowski space, which is based on Einstein's theory of relativity. Here he explains the the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen cycle. But he explains these things in a way which is so stupidly simple that it's just amazing. You feel like you're sitting in a lecture of one of the great scientists, sort of like the Richard Feynman, where he explains some things and it's so simple, and it's so much fun to read. The classic book in this genre is the illustrated Brief History of Time. This is again an illustrated edition. This is a 2-in-1 illustrated Brief History of Time and Universe in a Nutshell. This came out in the 90s, so it is a classic, and it's got some cheesy 90s computer graphic style illustrations. It does feel somewhat dated at time. Here he's got a picture of a star revolving around a black hole, creating X-rays because of the revolving ions and so on. Yeah, it is. It is a little cheesy, the illustrations, and it does feel a little dated. But it's nice to hear Stephen Hawking himself explain Hawking radiation and black holes, things that that he was on the forefront, and he's got a bit of the history behind that too. He talks about. So that's a book. I read it once when I was one of the first books I read when I was 13 years old, and I read it again a few years ago. I think it had a bigger impact on me when I was 13. I think since then there's been many other books that sort of have superseded it, but it's a great classic. And he's got a whole bunch of other books as well, which I've included in this, The Universe in a Nutshell, which is included in this volume. He's got one called The Grand Design, which he wrote together with Leonard Mlodinow and some other books. And then I also mentioned the books by Brian Greene. He's probably one of the most popular. He writes about string theory and M theory. I don't know if I'd call that astronomy so much. Most of it is more the math or the physics behind it. But I would have to include it in this same genre of books. And there's a whole bunch of the other ones. Sean Carroll is another author who's very well known. The Particle at the End of the Universe. I haven't read his books, but he's one of the most popular in this genre. And then in the next slide here is Michio Kaku. He's another great author. He writes about parallel universes and hyperspace and multidimensional space, physics of the future. He's got a whole bunch of books about sort of that more futuristic type of time travel and that type of physics. And I've lumped all these together in one, but there's a whole bunch of those that talk about a whole bunch of authors. Kip Thorne. I've got a book here about which is based on the movie, the Interstellar movie. I had to buy this one again because it's got beautiful illustrations. So, these are the images from the movie that was computer simulated, the black hole, what it would have looked like. And he explains the science behind it and how much research he put into actually. He was the scientific consultant on that movie. And this book explains a lot of that. But he writes a lot about black holes and all that. But there's many other authors. Steven Weinberg is a popular one. The book, The First 3 Minutes is a classic. I think it's written back in the 70s. And then you've got some other ones, Lee Smolin, Max Tegmark, Martin Rees, David Deutsch. You can check these out. There's many such books. But again, I wouldn't consider them astronomy per se. These are more relativity, age of the universe, Big Bang, and things like that. Next little section here is Origin of Life and Exoplanets. I've included this because this is interesting. This is a book that was recommended to me. I don't own the book, so you'll have to look at it on the slide. But this is a book that was recommended to me by Ian Shelton. Some of you might know him. Yeah, I think he's a RAS member. He gave a course at U of T when I was there about life on other planets. And this was a book that he recommended to me. The textbook of that course was called Life in the Universe by Bennett and Shostak. But this is interesting. It shows the origins of the different elements, how they came to Earth, and whether or not other planets can have life. That's a nice recommendation there. And along similar lines is Neil Shubin. This is his second book. His first book is Your Inner Fish, about evolution. And he's a paleontologist. This is not astronomy. It's just the first chapter, or the first couple of chapters, talks about the early age of the Earth and how life arose on Earth. So I've included it in this section here. But there's a bunch of books sort of in this same topic, which crosses between biology and exobiology and astronomy, which is interesting if you're interested in that. These are a couple read in that genre. The next section, I've already gone through some history, but the next section is like specific history and biography. The books I recommended earlier were general history about the Big Bang and Copernicus and our man's understanding of their place in the universe. But I've got a whole bunch of recommendations here about books about specific episodes in history. And one of the best authors in that is David Sobel. So this book here is called Longitude. Again, this is highly, highly recommended. This is the illustrated edition. You don't need to read the illustrated edition, but it's the story of John Harrison and how he invented the marine chronometer to solve the longitude problem for people finding their place at sea. And it's got pictures. This is finally, I mean, she shows here. Let's see if I can find it. This was his first marine chronometer, big machine with those springs over here to try to solve the problem of the ship swaying from side to side until finally he was able to make it accurate enough by shrinking it down to size. So this is a great book. She explains it really, really well. She tells the story really, really well. And I would highly recommend the TV series. There's a 2-part miniseries put out by A&E, the television channel A&E. You can find it on Amazon Prime, I think, but that television series I really, really recommend. The costumes, the music. It's a period piece that's really, really puts you in a place and really helps you understand the characters. And it features, King George and Neville Maskelyne and all these 18th century costumes and characters. Really, really highly recommend the TV series, even more than the book, I would say, unless you want the concepts to be explained to you a little bit more. And she's got a whole bunch of other books. Galileo's Daughter. Some of her books focus on women in astronomy. So Galileo's Daughter. This one here, The Glass Universe, and this is my Lego set of famous of women of NASA. So this came out as a special edition a few years ago. You've got Margaret Hamilton, Sally Ride, Mae Jemison, and Nancy Roman. I keep that on my shelf. But David Sobel, this is the story of the women who at Harvard. I think Chris in his presentation spoke about the Cepheids, and that was work that was done by I think this shows you here. Her name was Anne. Who was it? Anne. This is her. There it is. Anne Cannon and her telescope, and she meticulously labeled all the photographic plates, and she was able to figure out the different classes of stars, and through that was able to figure out how quickly they were receding, and that led to Hubble's great discovery. So this is a great book if you want to read about women in astronomy. And this is another one about Copernicus. And in the middle section of this book, called A More Perfect Heaven, about how Copernicus. This is a biography, and the interesting thing about this is that the middle section is written as a play, which is a conversation of Copernicus. So that's interesting. Another book I have here on the slide, I don't own this book, I haven't read this book, but this was recommended to me. It's called The Measure of All Things. It's the story of how they measured. These 2 French scientists were sent on a mission to measure the meridian in order to establish the metric system, to figure out exactly how big a meter was, because it was defined in terms of the meridian which ran through Paris. So this is an interesting book. Also features Cassini and some of the famous names from that 18th century period. So I put that along. I think it goes together nicely with David Sobel's books. Here's another one from a more modern period. This is Walter Lewin's books called For the Love of Physics. Now, he's a scientist. This is full of stories, personal stories. The book starts off sort of as an introduction to some basic science concepts, because he's famous for giving some series of physics lectures on YouTube where he does some crazy antics. But the book really gives his passion for science and doing science professionally. There's some pictures here in the middle. And he's famous for sending these balloons up and discovering some X-ray sources. So he really explains, I showed you that picture earlier of, in the Hawkins book, of the star revolving around the black hole. He actually he found some of the X-ray sources for this by sending up some of these balloons. And the book is full of stories, and he actually talks about meeting some of the great astronomers. This book really conveys his passion for science, and he has a whole chapter here where he talks about science and art and how important art is to him. So this is a really great book. It's a really personal story, which really conveys his passion for science. Next on the list is a book called, I don't have it here, it's called Lonely Hearts of the Cosmos by Dennis Overby. He was a editor or a writer for the Sky and Telescope magazine, I believe. He's a really good writer, and this is also a very personal story about the members of the Palomar Observatory and how they measure the age of the universe. And he focuses on a few key characters, which are a little less known. Alan Sandage is one of the characters he features. I think he's a lot in the style of, if you've read James Gleick's books, he has a book, Chaos, where he really delves into the biographies of the characters involved. So he's a good writer, and this is a good story, a very focused story about that period. Next on my list is American Eclipse. This I also don't own. I got this from the Toronto Public Library. This book came out just in time for the 2017 eclipse a couple of years ago. He came out with this book a couple of months before it to capitalize on that. And this is the story of the 1878 Great American Eclipse. And there's another one coming up in 2024. Don't miss that one. But this one passed through the Wild West. And this is the story of Thomas Edison, among other scientists, in the 1800s, when the West was still a wild country. They made a trip out there to observe, to make some key observations. One of the things they were looking for was the planet Vulcan, which you can read about in my next book, which is called The Hunt for Vulcan. This is the story of how Albert Einstein's theories destroyed a theory which was popular for a bit of time, that was hypothesized by Leverrier, who was the discoverer of Uranus, put forth a theory of the I got the bookmark here. He shows the perihelion of Mercury shifting over time, which wasn't explainable with Newton's law. So Leverrier put forth a theory that there was actually another planet, but nobody could observe the planet because the sun was in the way. It was supposed to be very, very close to the sun, and that's why they made these trips out to these eclipses. And he's got the story of the 1919 eclipse of Arthur Eddington, which is also covered. Let me go to the next book. Is the biography of Walter Isaacson of Einstein. Again, this is not an astronomy book, but he does cover the stories of the 1914, the aborted mission in the 1914 to make that observation, and the 1919 expedition to the eclipse in, was it Madagascar, where they actually confirmed Einstein's theories. So that brings us to the end of our list. And in my slides, I've included the complete list. So if you want, I can send this around. I've got the whole list of all the books that I covered in this talk. Are there any questions? Let's see.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. So I was saying, in the interest of time, we're going to have to move on to the announcements. We're running quite late this evening. I apologize, Joel, but a fantastic presentation, and we really enjoyed you showing us the books right off the shelf. It was very interactive. Well done.